Hello? Okay, there we go.
Yeah, it's off the board.
All right, we're going to get underway. We have one slight change to the program. Dina Srinivasan was unfortunately unable to join us, so a big thank you to Laura Edelson, who agreed last night to step in. Her bio is, I believe, in there because she was going to speak tomorrow, but she is a former chief technologist at the Justice Department and a professor at Northeastern. So we are actually doing our panel a little bit different from the others in that first I am going to give you an overview of the Google cases. So unlike the two other sort of case studies we've done, the AT&T was one case here in the US. Microsoft was sort of two cases, transatlantic here in EU. The Google cases are very global. I think it said in the program there's something like 100 cases against Google around the world. The other difference is obviously that these are still ongoing. So broadly speaking, next slide. I think you can sort of fill the Google cases into three big buckets: Android, search, or ad tech. You know, there's a little bit of variations on a theme within there. But I'm actually going to start with the first case that I think relates here, which is a 2015 case in Russia. Yandex, which was the Russian search engine, filed a complaint with the anti-monopoly service in Russia in February of 2015 over Google's contracts that required that it be the default on Android phones. And the FAS found pretty quickly that that violated the anti-monopoly law. And 2 years later, they entered a settlement with Google where it paid a sort of minor amount. It came out to about $7 million. But they also created a choice screen for phones within Russia. And this is a slide actually that was used in the Justice Department's case last fall. And you can see exactly what happened when they introduced the choice screen, which is where that line is. And then Yandex was able to actually gain back some of the market share that it had lost over to Google. And Google is now the number 2 in Russia. I keep pressing the wrong button. So the next one that's sort of along this lines is the EU Android case. They officially opened their probe also in 2015, sent a statement of objections in 2016, and fined Google 4.3 billion euros in 2018. Google proposed a choice screen that was going to be decided by an auction. Eventually, lots of people said that wasn't going to work for various reasons. They instead came up with a choice screen that is free. And this is what it looks like. The choice screen in Europe, however, didn't really work. This is another thing that was used in the Justice Department's case. This is what happened pretty much in the EU. You'll see Google is a line there at the top, and it doesn't really move. The only place that apparently it did work a little bit was in the Czech Republic, where there was already a search engine by the name of Seznam, which saw a slight uptick in usage when the choice screen went into effect. You can think a little bit about the Digital Markets Act as another attempt at a remedy for Google. It was designated as a gatekeeper and has more core platform services than any other of the gatekeepers. There are 8 of them, and that includes Google Android, the operating system, Google Chrome, and Google Play. There is another slight variation on the Android case that has come up both sort of within the DMA and what we call sort of the Google Play cases here in the US. Epic Games, the founder of Fortnite, filed a lawsuit in 2020. The next year, a group of US attorneys generals filed their own lawsuit challenging the contracts that Google has with Android manufacturers to make Google Play, the app store, the default on all Android phones. In December of last year, a federal jury found that those contracts violate the antitrust laws. And the court there is in the process of sort of working on a remedy. The search cases, there are 2 primary ones. The first one being the one that is most well known in the EU with Google Shopping. So this case technically started in 2010 with allegations that Google was preferencing its own products over those of rivals. There was a statement of objections in 2015 that decided to focus just on Google's shopping product called Google Shopping. In 2017, the EU finalized that probe, fined them $2 billion, ordered it to make changes. And these are some of the changes that they ended up making. You can sort of see what Google Shopping looked like first, what Google Shopping looked like after. There have been a lot of complaints that this is not a particularly effective remedy. One of these, the top one, is what it looks like now on desktop. So as you can see, there's this one little button there that you can click to see what comparative shopping services pricing looks like. And then this is actually Google's own graphic of what it looks like on a mobile phone. US v. Google is the one that was filed by the Justice Department here in October of 2020. I sometimes call it Google One because we have more than one. It was a little bit of a variation on the search and the Android. So the main allegation is that Google entered into contracts with various browsers and smartphone manufacturers to ensure that its search engine is the default on all of these places. So these are both slides that the Justice Department showed during their case, which went to trial last fall. Google is the default on the iPhone, on all Android mobile phones, and also in the Chrome browser. So when you just go up to the search box on any of these places, it automatically goes to Google. The bottom graph shows you that more than 50% of all of the search queries done in the US go through one of these default access points that automatically go to Google. And then the third sort of bucket is the ad tech bucket. This is a little bit more complicated, and so I'm very glad that Laura is here to help us through it. But the interesting thing about the ad tech inquiries is a lot of it actually sort of tended to start in Australia. In 2017, the Australian government asked the ACCC to take a look at the impact of online search engine and social media on competition in the media and advertising services market. What you can see in the top graph, this is taken from their report, is sort of how the introduction of online search and social media really cratered the advertising in the print media. So that purple thing is what had been the advertising in print media, and you can see that very quickly, sort of the yellow online one takes over. In 2020, the ISBA, which is a large advertising group, did a study of where does the money go when you buy an ad online. They hired PwC, the auditor, to sort of try and go through the process of looking at, when an advertiser spends $1, who gets the various bits of money. And the interesting thing that they found is when an advertiser spends $1, 51 cents of that goes to the website that eventually publishes the ad. The most interesting one is actually this little 15% in the middle. They actually couldn't figure out where that went. So 15 cents out of every dollar just sort of goes into the ether somewhere. The UK CMA did its own study into online advertising, and it sort of found what was interesting about its thing was it found that Google has very massive shares in some aspects of this marketplace. You can see sort of along the top row, it shows various things, we call them like sections of the ad tech stack. And you can see in there that Google in some places dominates as much as 80 or 90%, or even in the ones in the middle where it's not as dominant, it still has 50 to 60% was their estimate. The UK CMA also opened a separate investigation into Google's plan to get rid of third-party cookies in the Chrome browser because there were a lot of concerns among advertisers about how they would be able to sort of continue to be able to see where their money goes without cookies. This is another version on the same chart from before that the ACCC did. The second sort of set of this is the ones that are specifically looking at litigating a case against Google over the ad tech stack. The first one was Texas v. Google. This was the state case that was brought in December of 2020. US v. Google, which Google too, was brought in January of 2023. And the EU also has a very similar case. These, I put in here one of the most interesting things that they had found in that, which is that in addition to its control over the actual sort of machinery doing these advertisements, Google also changed sometimes the rules of how it conducted the auctions. So this one talks about Project Bernanke, which was a sort of project that Google had internally that would give less money to publishers, keep the remainder, and in order to inflate bids later. These cases are all ongoing. The trial in U.S. v. Google is scheduled for September. The trial in Texas v. Google is supposed to be in March of next year. And lastly, the thing I just wanted to mention is something that came out of some of the advertising services inquiries, which is this idea of investing more in news through creating news bargaining codes. So after the ACCC did its first investigation, Australia adopted a news bargaining code that requires Google and Facebook to negotiate with publishers for money in exchange for the referral traffic. If they don't reach an agreement among themselves, they have to engage in what I'm told is called baseball-style arbitration. So each side makes an offer. Google obviously makes a low one. The publisher makes a very high one. And the arbitrator has to pick one or the other. And so that sort of incentivizes them to come up with a decision on their own. In the first year of the Australian News Bargaining Code being in existence, Google and Facebook paid out more than $200 million Australian, which is the equivalent of about 150 million US. This was also recently adopted in Canada. Last summer, they adopted an online news act. They're still in the process of implementing it. But Google has already said that they will pay out 100 million Canadian a year, which runs to about 72 million US. Right now, California is considering adopting its own bill very similar to this. What's interesting about that is like Australia has about 26 million people, Canada 38 million people. That's about the same size actually as California, which has about 39 million people. So that's sort of just an overview of the various Google cases that we're going to be talking about. First, I'd like to start with Christopher. So the EU remedies in both Android and shopping are sort of widely viewed as not working. Why? Any thoughts that you have on why? And what does this suggest about maybe what the Justice Department should seek in its cases?
Well, thank you very much, Leah, and it's a pleasure to be here. What I find really, well, to preface this, one of the things, the perspectives I bring to this is really influences a book that I'm working on right now, along with a number of co-authors on a volume, which is the DMA marks a move, if you will, from competition law principles and to the point where of what they is clearly framed as ex-ante regulation. And it's funny, Heike Schweitzer, who wrote who's a friend of mine, we invited her to Penn, who was one of the authors who worked with Stager on the initial studies. We were putting on a program for her, and I called her, the next turn in competition law, and she says, no, you cannot call it competition law, it's ex-ante regulation. And if you look at the publications by the EU itself, they're very consistent that way. What's striking to me, though, is particularly in the remedy side, there's actually very little analysis of the history in ex-ante regulation implementing the types of remedies involved, often called for here. And it's funny, we heard discussions about how sometimes choice screens don't work. You have evidence in Yandex where it does. There's often a sense just by increasing choice, this will solve everything. That's clearly, one, not true on the facts. I mean, we see this, we saw this with the Microsoft remedies. We see this in a lot of different places. And the interesting question is, why not? And what strikes me is there's a couple things. There's some very nice work in telecom which says that some interfaces are complex and information intensive, that they don't actually lend themselves to these types of remedies. If you want to giggle out of telecom lawyers, talk about the 1996 Act, which is so universally regarded as a failure that anytime someone does something in telecom regulation, which in the US these days is about net neutrality, they immediately, both FCC chairs say, we're not doing unbundling. It's become so tainted that they distance themselves from it because it just didn't work. And so I think there's a level of analysis at the technical side. But the other problem we've got is that, is a point that was made in the earlier panel about Microsoft ships all its products with Bing as the default search engine. And in fact, if you're dealing with a Microsoft product, they often are quite sticky in trying to keep you from changing the defaults, whether it's browsers or anything else. And we're finding that Windows users shift them, I think it's 90% of the time. And so the point is, the fact that someone has a large share, and this is inherent in the consistent rejections in US law of no-fault monopoly, going back to rejection of structured conduct performance, the rejection of the Neal Commission, the Rita and Turner proposals, the repeated Phil Hart proposals, is that in fact, success in the marketplace, large market share is ultimately ambiguous. It can be from successful competition on the merits or anti-competitive activity. And we need some filter which we will use exclusionary conduct for, to separate the two. And the problem you see when you see the remedies essentially not being adopted by consumers, it's somewhat probative looking back that, in fact, the reason that they had the large shares, they're offering a better product. And so in some ways, we're learning from that process. You mentioned Android too. It's not going to figure large because it's just not that heavy in the cases themselves. There's a bigger case in Europe. One of the things that strikes me is another fact, which is consumers aren't the only people who are extremely uncomfortable with Google's position in Android. Samsung and Huawei are as well. And Samsung for years has tried to do what Google did, go back to the Linux source code, open source. Anyone can do this. Amazon did it. And they're actually trying to create their own operating system called Tizen. Huawei's trying to do Harmony. Two very technically sophisticated companies have been almost completely unsuccessful. Huawei claimed it did it. They've actually looked at the code. It was copied from Google. So what you see here is there's an interesting argument as you look at the facts. You realize that, in fact, this is consistent with Google actually making a significant contribution in integrating what was or when they acquired it, a fewer than 10 employee firm with no revenue trying to develop operating systems for digital cameras. That was the ambition. And they turned it into something, they saw something, and the interesting question is, are they successful because of the combination or because of some activity that they've done? So I think that we need some traction on this, and you also need to try to understand, going back to what I think of in Microsoft, the theory of harm. The remedy they asked for in Microsoft, and we don't know in Google case because they haven't told us what the remedy the government's seeking yet. They had all these theories about how the fusion of browser and Java were going to protect their OS market. Remedy, divest Microsoft Office. And for those of us trying to see coherent theories, you kind of scratch your head because the theory and as evidence presented had nothing to do with that. And when you see some of these choice screens and different things, there is an ethic, sometimes just by giving people more choice, it'll change it all. We found that that's generally doesn't work that often that well. And I will say that the last thing, another thing people complain about in terms of getting access, there's a couple more things I can say. One is there is a problem here which shows up in my colleague Herb Covenkamp has taken over the Rita treatise. He's written about this. It shows up in Justice Breyer's dissent in Iowa Utilities Board. It shows up in Trinco. It shows up in a lot of different places, which is if you're going to actually mandate access to a platform where one of the partners is essentially unwilling, generally they will comply with law, but only just. Sort of the way I just paid my taxes, which is, I paid what I was supposed to do. I did not throw an extra contribution in out of the goodness of my heart. And so what you discover is Federal Railroad, which is the genesis of all this, went to the Supreme Court 3 times. Why? They were always fighting about price, factor prices change, demand changes, theory, all these things. But in addition, what they discovered in the telecom side is you have to do a fairly comprehensive monitoring of a large number of non-price, if not all the non-price terms. Delays, credit, you name it. 60 days notice of changes, all that. Some of it, there's a reasonable notice of requirement, but you're going to see that, in fact, these sorts of remedies, in the words of Trinco, whoever doesn't want to do business has an unending bag of dirty tricks they can play. And so institutionally, if you're going to implement these remedies, you have to be really prepared to do that well. The last thing I'll say, the one thing that other remedy floating around there beyond access, and we can talk about access to data, which is a big part of this. Access to data is actually really hard. Interestingly, both Google and Facebook provide data portability right now. Part of it is the lack of a client to port it over, but the big problem is the lack of compatibility among data. There's a whole question, how are we going to solve that? Are we going to mandate something, and then who pays for reconfiguring the inconsistent data into it? Is it the user? Is it the platform? But more importantly, data determines functionality in a very profound sort of way, and that's going to change. It's going to be constantly changing. And if we have that as a mandatory interface, it could chase. Last thing, I've never quite, I've got enough gray hair in my head. I've always been baffled by the objection to Google bidding for the default search engine position on browsers. And we focus on Apple, but I was always thinking about Mozilla. The first paper I wrote was on broadcast television. And for those of us who are now, the only people who watch broadcast television are people my age. My kids laugh at me when they talk about this. But there was a very similar situation where you had a content aggregator who was driven mostly by advertising and a distribution mechanism which couldn't charge prices. That was television. And we had antitrust cases back then, even if we had zero prices. So what happened? The content distributor paid for distribution, not out of the goodness of their heart. They needed to reach advertisees with their message. And in an unfunded distribution channel, the only way it made sense to pay for the reach. It's like, it's paying for your delivery men. It's this delivery services. It's the same idea. And the idea that is happening, I find completely consistent with the pricing structure, because the only alternative would be people pay for browsers and get a revenue stream that way, because that's what we have in cable television. So the fact that payment's happening makes sense to me, because it makes sense for an unpriced place that's delivering value to someone else to actually get paid for that service. The interesting thing, though, is if we then cut off that auction, Mozilla said it will die. 90% of its revenue comes from that auction. And so it's an interesting question about the secondary effects it would have. You'd mean that only vertically integrated companies would survive because they have their own browsers, they don't have to make that side payment. And we can have an argument about what the prices are, but that's not something we do very well in antitrust. But the fact that there is a side payment happening there is not a problem. And it is really weird to me that the only complainant significantly in that space is Microsoft. And in terms of capital formation or sophistication and their public claims that they are going to win the next auction. And if they can't, the only reason could be is that they weren't willing to bid as much money as Google. And that would mean that because they couldn't generate as much revenue to justify the bid as Google. And so, in that world, the one actor who doesn't need any government help in this whole world, on this environment, to me, would be Microsoft. Because I think they've got the technical sophistication and the capital to do it. More importantly, I do think there'd be a secondary impact on the browser ecosystem and that competitiveness of that market and all these other things that it's an out-of-market efficiency. I understand all that. There's some limitations to that. But there would be consequences to this that I don't think have been adequately thought through, particularly in the structure, the way this market's structured, that makes this distribution mechanism make sense to me.
Okay, thank you. Cory or Laura, is there anything you wanted to say in response to that, or?
No, I'll hold off.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I'll do the same. I'll save it.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. We're going to go to Cory next.
Sure.
You have developed this theory of enshittification. I hope we can say that, which I think is actually a sort of clever way of describing like what happens when a monopolist takes over. How about you describe
Sure.
your theory? and how it
Yeah,
relates
so
to Google?
I heard Gary earlier talking about how difficult it is to get normies to care about this. I've been trying to do it for 20 years. It turns out the secret is you just need to swear. Antitrust is not an all ages event anyways. It's fine. So enshittification is the phrase I came up with to explain the sudden late stage platform collapse syndrome that we're living through right now. And it takes the model of a disease, a pandemic that's sweeping across these platforms that are the endemic form of enterprise on the internet. So the symptoms are pretty familiar to anyone who's used a platform. The platform in the first stage has a surplus. It allocates it to its users. The users find that attractive. They flock to the platform. They get locked in by some mechanism. Then some of that surplus is withdrawn, and it's handed over to business customers. And those business customers pile into, they also become locked to the platform. And then that is withdrawn again. So it's such that there's just a sufficiency, like a quantum of value left behind on the platform that makes the platform sticky for business customers and end users who are mostly just holding each other hostage at this point. And then all the other value is returned to the shareholders. The problem with that from the perspective of a good internet is not just that we're all stuck using these terrible platforms. It's that it's a brittle equilibrium. The difference between I hate this, but I can't leave it, and I hate this, and I am leaving it is very thin. And when people start to leave these platforms that are accustomed to growth and who are very sensitive to investors who get very freaked out when they don't post the growth they expected or post losses, then they panic. And the term in Silicon Valley for panicking is pivoting. And so, one company said, yes, I know we promised you the future was that you're going to argue with your racist uncle using a primitive text interface forever, but I had a revelation. Actually, the future is I'm going to convert you and everyone you love into a legless, sexless, low polygon, heavily surveilled cartoon character in a virtual world called the metaverse we stole from a 25-year-old cyberpunk novel. Or, Google saying our search results are very poor, therefore we're going to replace them with summaries generated by a kind of habitual liar, spicy autocomplete. So that's the symptomology, and I think we can all recognize it. What's the underlying mechanism? Well, the underlying mechanism is that these are digital platforms, and a digital platform is nimble. It can alter the business logic, everything from payments to search priority, prices, from a second-to-second basis on a per-user basis. This makes digital tools into pumps that can rapidly move value from end users to business customers, from business customers to end users, or from both to shareholders in the moment. And so, as with any shell game, it's the quickness of the hand that deceives the eye. People have watched this happen very quickly, and they've concluded that it's something very sophisticated. But if you've ever watched Penn and Teller do the cup and balls slowed down with transparent cups, you'll know that it's actually a very straightforward trick done really quickly. And computers can do these tricks very quickly, which means that rather than conceiving of these firms as being staffed by dopamine hacking, all-powerful evil sorcerers, we should think of them as what they are, just the same mediocre sociopaths with faster hands, practicing the lesson that everyone learns in the Darth Vader MBA. I have altered the arrangement, pray I don't alter it further. So why is this all happening now? What's the epidemiology? What's the contagion that's causing all the platforms to go south at once? I don't think it's the end of ZERP. Facebook was going downhill long before interest rates went up. I don't think it's because we had heroic founders who had vision and cared about the long-term health of their companies, and then they left and were replaced by bloodless bean counters. Google got worse when the Google boys came back during the AI pivot/panic. I think it's because the constraints that historically discipline these firms, whenever they pursued enshittification, have melted away. So we had lax competition enforcement, and so the internet degenerated into 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4. As Lily Tomlin used to say in that series of short documentaries she did for Saturday Night Live about the phone company, we don't care, we don't have to, we're the phone company. They don't care, they don't have to, they bought 90% of the search market. Market concentration, in turn, reduces the number of firms in each sector, which not only gives them monopoly rents that they can spend on lobbying adventures, but as I said earlier in my remarks from the floor, it solves the collective action problem of message discipline so that they can go to regulators and speak with one voice and capture those regulators, which is how we arrive at a phase in which the platforms routinely violate our consumer rights, our privacy rights, our labor rights, but insist that it's no problem because they did it with an app, and it's not a violation when you do it with an app. That same regulatory capture isn't confined to ignoring the law. It also involves mobilizing the law against new entrants and people who would seek to moderate or modify their services. This is the vast expansion of IP law that has come along with the drawdown of every other form of law that protects the public. And that allows the firms to mobilize the state to shut down interoperators who want to disenshittify their products with add-ons or bolt-ons. So imagine you're at a product meeting for a website, and someone says, folks, our KPI here is ad revenue. We can get an extra 2% ad revenue if we make the ads 20% more invasive and obnoxious. Someone else at that table who doesn't care about user welfare or their well-being is still going to put their hand up and says, what happens when 40% of our users go to the search engine and type, how do I block ads? Because the revenue doesn't stay at 100%. It doesn't rise to your projected 102%. It goes to 0 forever because no user ever went back to the search engine and typed, how do I start seeing ads again? Now, contrast this with the next item of business on that at that product planning meeting, which is what do we do about our app? That same person isn't going to say, let's not make the ads 20% more obnoxious, let's keep them where they are. They're going to say, let's make the ads 100% more obnoxious, because Section 1201 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act makes it a felony punishable by a 5-year prison sentence and a $500,000 fine to reverse engineer the app. And so if you go to the search engine and you type, how do I stop seeing ads? The answer you'll get is you can't. And so that's the third constraint. We've lost interoperability. Now, the fourth constraint was the labor power of tech's once very strong labor force, who were often extremely impassioned about the quality of the products that they made and the users that they served. We heard a lot about AT&T Unix. It reminded me of a story I heard at a tribute to Dennis Ritchie, one of the founders of AT&T Unix and a great fellow in computing history, about how the academics who were at the top of the distribution of AT&T Unix would sometimes get mysterious phone calls from Bell Labs prefixes saying, I'm not going to tell you who this is, but if you go to this park near Bell Labs and look behind a rock, you'll find a data tape with the bug fix for that bug you haven't been able to fix. Employees have stood as a bulwark against enshittification, but after 260,000 tech layoffs, after Google fired 12,000 skilled technologists 8 months after an $80 billion stock buyback that would have paid their wages for 27 years, employees aren't stepping up to defend their users either. Enshittification is not the consequence of worse people running these companies. The people who run these companies have always been terrible. Every day for 20 years, the bosses of these companies showed up for work, went to the giant lever on the wall marked enshittification, and pushed it as high up as it would go. But it didn't move. It didn't move because it was constrained by competition, by regulation, by the threat of interoperability, and by their own workforce. Today, those same people show up, and they push that lever with the same amount of ardor, and it moves farther. And so that's why the entire internet is turning into a pile of shit.
Thank you. Laura is going to talk a little bit about the ad tech ecosystem and how it developed. And this is
I'm so sorry. Yeah, it's not going to be anywhere near as fun, but we'll do our best. So just one brief correction. I was not the chief technologist of the Department of Justice. I was the chief technologist of the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice. So even more fun. Okay, and as you can see, I made these slides 2 hours ago as I was getting ready to be on this panel. So what I thought we should talk about, if we're going to talk about ad tech, the ad tech stack is incredibly complicated. One of my general tech pet peeves is that a lot of things are presented as being much more complicated than they actually are. The ad tech stack is complicated. So I thought the easiest way to approach this, if we're going to talk about this, if we're going to take case, I want you to understand what it is we're talking about, because you need to do that in order to understand potential remedies. So I think the easiest way to do this is to talk about how this stack got built. It got built over time. So prior to 1995, well, actually, let's take one step back. Prior to what we have now as the internet, ARPANET was non-commercial. There were no ads. And then we got the internet that could have commercial activity, and we started to get ads. That's all prior to 1995. The first banner ad had a 44% click-through rate. It was for AT&T. So times have changed. But in 1995, we got DoubleClick. DoubleClick created software that could, if you ran a website, you could add this ASP, and it would display ads, and you could show ads, you could sell ads. Great, 1995. Several competitors started proliferating over the next couple of years. There were a couple of them, but DoubleClick was the first and frankly, always the biggest and the best. In 1996, the Interactive Advertising Bureau was founded. So data brokers existed prior to the internet, but in 1996, that's when data brokers came to the internet, because all of a sudden we had display ads, and advertisers wanted to know who they were advertising to, and data brokers very quickly came in to fill this need. So this the Internet Advertising Bureau was just a trade organization. So this is the umbrella under which data brokers began to function and came into the field. In 1999, DoubleClick purchased Abacus Direct, which was actually a very old data broker. They had done data brokering for catalogs. But the reason that this is really important, very rarely does the consumer data part of the ad tech stack get talked about, but it's completely integral. This was the first major purchase that DoubleClick made, because fundamentally, if you're going to sell ads, advertisers want to know who they are being shown to. So where's my slides? Okay. And then so this sort of chugged along. We had some companies that would allow you to sell banner ads. These were getting integrated with data brokers. And then between 2002 and 2006, we see the rise of ad exchanges. Because there were, there was DoubleClick, there were some really large internet properties even then. So Yahoo was a big property. There were a few others. Advertisers wanted to be able to potentially route their ads to multiple places. That's where ad exchanges first started to pop up. There were a few big ones: Right Media, AdBright, Pubmatic, and then, so then this was like another. As the ad exchanges started to proliferate, ad exchanges came up to solve this problem of, hey, there are multiple places I could route my ads to. I'll use an ad exchange to solve that problem. Well, now there are multiple ad exchanges. How do I know how to interact well with all of these multiple ad exchanges? So then in 2007, both what are called the buy-side platform. Buy-side are people who would like to, they're advertisers, or people who want you to see ads. And who will like pay money to a website to show you an ad. And then there's the sell side, which are websites, sometimes referred to as publishers, because a lot of big websites are like media publishers. So in 2007, buy side and sell side platforms rise up that can interact with multiple exchanges. So Invite Media is the first big buy side platform that can route ads to multiple exchanges, and on the sell side, AdMeld is the first really big like sell side platform that can allow a website to take traffic from multiple exchanges. Also at this point, some of the exchanges start to consolidate. So Yahoo buys Right Media. There's some other consolidations that are going on. And the rest of of this decade is a lot of consolidation. So Google buys DoubleClick in 2008. Google buys Invite Media in 2010. Google buys AdMeld in 2011. And by 2012, we really see the rise of what's called real-time bidding. So up until this point, a lot of this sales activity was pre-programmed. If you're an ad executive, you might come in and you might decide, okay, I think these are the kinds of audiences and properties I want to advertise on over the next week, and you might try to go buy those ads. By 2012, this new technology gets created that allows ads to be sold a lot like stocks are sold. So we get real-time bidding that allows effectively an instantaneous auction that I assume most people here are familiar with for your eyeballs starts to happen, where as soon as you load a page, an incredibly fast auction takes place to sell your attention to the highest bidder. And you'll notice that when this happens, by this point, Google has purchased effectively a controlling stake in every layer by which this real-time bidding is going to happen. So I took this slide from the Department of Justice complaint, but what you'll see is what is alleged here is that DoubleClick for Publishers, which is the publisher ad server. This is how, if you're a publisher, you both display and route your traffic effectively. That has a 90% market share. This is not really, I believe that this one is not even, like Google doesn't even contest this one at all. So there's a little bit more competition on the ad exchange level. AdX, which is Google's ad exchange, has about a 50% market share, is alleged by the Department of Justice. And then on the buy side, there are two different markets for the buy side, because there are these really big advertisers that are like the big ad agencies, think those folks, the really, really big companies. And then there are like little mom and pops. So they're functionally two different markets. But it doesn't really matter because Google has an 80% market share of one and a 40% market share of the other. So this is the resulting world that we have built up. And I think I'm at time, so I should stop here.
Okay, great. So I would like each of you to think if you were king or queen of the world and you could devise a remedy on your own of anything you wanted in one of these cases, I would like you to describe what it would be. So I'd actually like to start with Christopher. What would your proposed remedy be for Google search or Google Android?
So whatever you do for remedies has to be motivated by the scope of liability and the theory of liability. I mean, otherwise otherwise you end up with disconnects. And you have to start with, under U.S. law, you're actually under no duty to deal with rivals. You're under no general duty to make your products compatible or interoperable with rivals, subject to a number of exceptions, generally about courses of dealing. And so the first question is in the front, like, we have to make sure that the remedy is actually tailored to any scope of liability finding, that it fits pretty well. And so that's sort of a general caveat. To pick the different aspects, you had me initially talk about the search cases. What really strikes me is there's different theories of harm in the search cases. The one is that Google's greater access and greater volume of existing searches, to the extent to which searches results are produced from prior data on searches, scale has an inherent advantage. And so therefore, the problem here is actually access to data. So if that's the theory you're going to go under, all the other things about blocking, distribution, and all that, it makes sense getting access to data. And it's an interesting question about what the scale effects are there. One of the competitors who testified in the case, when asked what market share, what scale do you need to be an effective competitor to Google on the search side, under testimony for the government's witness, answer was 2.5% market share. Now, I don't know what the numbers are. I mean, this is all an evidentiary question, but there's a great factual question out there. How much data is really required? Determine the fashion, the remedy, how to make that go. There can be long-tail results that are fairly rare. It could be a lot of different things that we need to analyze to make sure it's effective, but that is a fact-based question. That would make sense that way. If the concern around buying default market share, that's a foreclosure theory based on distribution, not on access to data. And if that's the theory, then that makes sense, and you'd have a remedy that could go that way. But we all know that cornering markets is actually relatively expensive. It's one of these things that you have to do. You have to not only cut off all the existing sources of it, you have to do the alternative sources and the different aspects that'll come in, and we have to think about secondary reliances on other markets. Now, what's lurking over the whole thing to me is the danger that we're generals fighting the last war, which is we're talking about how search is done historically. One of the things you see about all the news is that, in fact, the real front in this war is one, incorporating AI into search. Now, AI is not based on historical data of search data. It's based on large language models, based on correlations of words, generally published on presumably large reservoirs of public data based on the scale necessary. We know ChatGPT was trained on Reddit data. We know ChatGPT 3 was trained on Wikipedia data. We don't know what ChatGPT 4 was trained on, plus a little bit of proprietary data. The dimension, if that move happens, the dimensions to compete in the search engine market change completely. So one of the interesting things, my reactions to Cory's presentation, he's essentially making a life cycle theory. And I've actually written papers on, there's a thing you learn in business school when I was there, and in all fairness, I used to work for Procter & Gamble, the biggest advertiser in the world, in their advertising department. So I have my own sense of this. Product life cycle theory is something every business school student is taught. But what we've discovered is, in fact, the life cycles aren't unitary. They revitalize. There's a bunch of other things going on. And that, in fact, we talk about Tim, who's now you came back, Master Switch is based on life cycle theories. And in fact, what in the book review I wrote in the Chicago Law Review, we found that it's in many of the industries, it's sometimes more complicated. And understanding the natures of those complications and changes becomes as important, because even within the normal science, the normal development, you see big changes. The one that's lurking out there is not the use of AI to improve search, it's the use of AI to replace search. And that is a big question. I think it's too early in the game to know if that's going to happen, but you're seeing a lot of reports about that. In that case, what we need to analyze and what we need to remedy is going to look very, very different based on what the theory of harm is going to be. The other thing, we talked briefly about I can't resist when we talk about the Android case. On some level, I think we have a little bit of myopia in the sense that if we remember all the way back to 2004, the dominant operating system with 70% market share was Symbian, which is what Microsoft bought. And so we see these very different worlds, and we see a fairly dynamic world. And from what I understand, I've never got great documentation of this. Android was a defensive action against against Apple before it ran away with the market. It's an interesting question, but we see things certain like there's all different parts of that case. The anti-fragmentation agreement has a lot of things that make me feel better. So I wrote a paper looking at the history of open source operating systems. And someone said Unix is successful. It's now basically dead. No one's writing for it. We have legacy installations, and it's basically because no one was minding the store. And if you look at the literature on open source, we have this idea that's this bottom-up, nirvana. If you read the literature, they're called benevolent dictatorships. And the reason Linux succeeded is because Linus Torvalds says yes and no. And that's sort of the interpretation. And if that's the case, you see a very different world here. And you see that, in fact, and I think the things I'm interested in, how easy is it to sideload? The anti-fragmentation is a real problem because forking open source is a disaster, but it's non-exclusive. And in fact, my Android phone has not only Chrome on it, but it also has Samsung's internet browser, and the internet browser is figured more prominently. And you can go through these different aspects. That's a really interesting question about where the real leverage lies. The only, I'll talk only briefly about ad tech. The other thing, the sensibility I have for me, just to make something clear about the excellent presentation, is that is about display ads. And we could say display ads are their own market and do this analysis that way. As a former advertiser, I would say that I didn't care how I advertised. In addition to that, I've got search ads, I've got old-fashioned ads, television, print, radio. I cared about ROI. And in fact, I was in all these markets tuning the knobs, and Procter & Gamble is experimenting pretty big in this way. So in that sense, the real question for me empirically is do ad purchasers regard these as substitutes? And in fact, how dependent are we on that one platform for one dimension of advertising? How much does it go? And antitrust has very traditional tools to get at those things. And that market definition sitting at the bottom of the ad market is critical because one of the ways the ACCC got out of this is it declared that social media advertising and search adding were separate markets. And if that's the case, it's pretty easy to make them, we all know the market definition. We've been living this long enough. It makes them look, it's easy to make one firm look dominant. There's an empirical question that needs to be asked. Do the people who actually purchase ads regard them, do they switch in response to price? And if they do, that's a great question we can have a trial on and evidence on and actually get a testable, falsifiable premise on which to base remedies and cases as opposed to constructing things so a company looks big and bad.
Laura, you have the magic wand. What is your remedy, particularly with regard to ad tech?
So with regard to ad tech, many of the remedies that are being sought both in the United States and in the EU come down to unwinding these many acquisitions. Because, Chris, you talk about, they made this, they made that, they acquired this, they acquired that, they merged to get this, they merged to get that. Very little of the ad tech stack we were talking about, ad tech created. As you point out, they acquired quite a bit in many spaces. And one of the things that I think is a really interesting and powerful thing about software is that making copies is basically free. And something that has been really, really powerful as a component of remedies in other spaces is requiring companies not just to sell one copy of a database, but to sell multiple. And to, in that way, you can really magnify the power of competition and allow multiple different products to be developed on a floor of some database product that gets sold. I think there is a real opportunity in either this or other cases that fundamentally come down to software. Why divest it only once when you could divest it twice? This isn't perfect, right? There is hardware involved, there are other things, but a lot of this stuff, you could sell multiple copies of it. You could divide a customer book, and it would allow for a much more vibrant and rich ecosystem. There were a few things that Chris said that I just wanted to respond to that I think are somewhat related here. You talked about Unix being failed. Which open source Unix? Because there was the closed source Solaris, like there was a bunch of closed source and not open source Unixes. And when you talk about, Linux worked because Linus was a jerk. Linus was a jerk. Everyone agrees that was useful in parts, but also Linux got forked. There's 10 Linuxes and they serve different needs. So I just don't think this argument works on either side because it just isn't factual. And I do think that there is a lot of benefit, that we get from competition around things that are interoperable. We see that in so many markets, and I think there's a real opportunity in the ad market because we do have standards. This is a point you make, and you're quite right, that data aren't always the same as other data. But in this case, we actually have a lot of really well-developed standards that already exist. All we have to do is pull them off the shelf and use them.
Cory, I'm going to give you the magic wand.
Sure. I also wanted to respond briefly to something Chris said. I think that you're right that I'm describing a life cycle, but I don't think that it's teleological. I'm not saying that this is inevitable. I'm saying the way to explain why these companies run by the same people who are the same flawed vessels that they were 10 years ago as they are today, made things that we liked 10 years ago and now make things that we hate, is because the constraints that stop them from making things bad in order to make things better for themselves melted away, right? That when they became too big to fail, when they became too big to jail, they became, in the words of Chair Lena Khan, too big to care. And so this is how we get these zombie firms shambling along that produce substandard products, but where they're still able to buy the market and prevent entry by rivals. And now to come to my magic wand, also to prevent the kind of incremental entry of rivals that historically has benefited large tech firms. Because we talk a lot about network effects when we're lucky. Gary before said he wished we could get some more network effects in this. What we don't talk about a lot is switching costs. And the switching costs for digital technology are intrinsically very low because the only computer we know how to make is the universal Turing complete von Neumann machine, and it runs every program we know how to write. And so there is nothing technically that stops you from installing third-party ink or installing a third-party app store or so on. You just have to reverse engineer it. And we have this theory that the reason no one's doing any reverse engineering is that these firms are so competent that no one can figure out how to reverse engineer their stuff. Never mind that there are defects like Checkmate, that is 8 generations of iPhone, an unpatchable defect that allows you to jailbreak it if you can legally. But you can't, because over the last 40 years, we've monotonically increased the scope of IP rights, and tech firms have managed to construct a thicket around themselves that Jay Freeman memorably calls felony contempt of business model, where reverse engineering of the sort that Apple engaged in when it cloned Microsoft Office file formats in order to make iWork, or that Google engaged in when they showed up at every website in the world and said, hello, I'm just a regular average end user. Can I have all the web pages you have, please? Or that every other tech firm engaged in as it became a giant, that conduct is no longer permissible because they'll hit you with tortious interference with contract, they'll hit you with Computer Fraud and Abuse Act claims, DMCA 1201, anti-compete, trade secrecy, copyright, patent, trademark, and so on. And so what we've done is we've eliminated the historic mechanism by which switching costs were lowered by tech firms so that someone didn't have to choose between the printer and the ink. They could get the printer they liked and the ink they liked, and they could choose which vendor they could go from. When the firm gets to prescribe the conduct of its customers, its critics, and its competitors, that firm will abuse that power. No firm should have that power. So this brings me to my remedy. In the European Union, we have the Digital Markets Act, and it is attempting to impose mandates for interoperability. I think those are a good idea, but I also think that they're going to have enforcement problems, which we heard about earlier. To a first approximation, everybody who understands how Facebook's infra works is a Facebook engineer. So when Facebook says we pulled the big switch that shut down the API, because we thought someone had broken into the API and was stealing 1 billion users' data. And you say, no, it was a pretext because you had an effective competitor and their users were moving from Facebook to somewhere else, but continuing to send messages using that API back to the people they left behind because they enjoyed low switching costs, because there's interoperability. You're going to spend 10 years performing a proctological exam on Facebook's servers to figure out what really happened. And 10 years later, it would have happened 1,000 times more. And so what else could we do? Well, it's very on brand. Forgive my European friends. I was a European until Brexit. I'm sorry, I'd like to be a European again. If anyone here is with the Polish government, you could help speed up my passport application. Very on brand for the European Union to tell firms how they must behave. It would likewise be very much on brand for America to just say YOLO, right? to say, once you are a convicted monopolist, you get a special master, and that special master has to approve any litigation threats that you bring against nascent competitors or existing competitors who engage in reverse engineering, right? And that special master is looking for a nexus with privacy, consumer protection, or labor protection laws. And if they see no nexus, the case can't be brought. And so we open up the space for everyone to do unto big tech, as big tech did unto everyone else when they got started, but without the move fast and break things ethos that says, okay, we're going to violate your rights, but we're going to claim it's okay because we did it with an app, right? So the problem here isn't that Google is scraping the web. The problem here is that we can't scrape Google. And there's a search engine. I wasn't paid by them or anything. There's a search engine that costs $10 a month to join. I just joined it. It's called Kagi, K-A-G-I. And the first time I used it, I was like, this is a quasi-religious experience like unto the experience I had the first time I used Google 25-ish years ago, where I went from Alta Vista, where every search was terrible, to a search engine where every search was great. And so I was just motoring along using it. And then I read a report by Jason Kobler on 44 Media, who revealed that Kagi pays for API access to Google, and that these are Google results filtered by someone who cares about the quality, right? So the reason that this search engine costs $10 a month is they have to pay Google API prices as well as other operating expenses. That's great. I like that option is out there. I'd also like to be able to scrape Google and have a go at filtering it myself. And I think that given that Google scraped us all when they started, that's fair play, right? Of course, every pirate wants to be an admiral. When they did it, that was progress. If we do it to them, that's piracy. We don't have to believe that. And it would be a very American, European combo act for the Europeans to stand up a remedy that is very strong and reliable, but also very brittle. And for the Americans to stand up a remedy that's very loosey-goosey, fills all the cracks, doesn't always work, but provides the flexibility that serves as a complement to the rigid but reliable European remedy, so that firms that follow the European remedies and offer APIs that are of high quality and that are reliable enough for rival firms to use them never have to do hand-to-hand combat with engineers who are reverse engineering the way that their stuff works and creating unquantifiable risks that they're going to have to disclose to their shareholders at the end of the next quarter and possibly trigger off another one of those mass sell-offs like we saw in Q1 of 22, where Facebook lost $250 billion because they had slightly worse news than they'd projected. And that $250 billion, the people who felt it the worst were the Facebook executives who made those decisions, because they're the ones whose portfolios are most top-heavy with Facebook stock.
All right. Audience questions. We'll go to Eric first.
Yeah, a question for Laura. Is another possible, so people have been talking about interoperability and the difficulties of that, and I wondered whether you thought that was a possible remedy for the, for the ad tech system, and what would it look like, I suppose?
I mean, especially as part of a larger remedy, I do think so. I mean, these companies have already had to negotiate the interfaces between, if I had that slide up, all of those arrows are APIs, right? So we already have commonly agreed standards. Short answer, yeah. definitely, it's not even that hard, mostly because the work has already been done.
So Ron had talked about how difficult it was to monitor this kind of comparable remedy with Microsoft, and would you say it would require the same kind of effort here, or is it a different?
Absent a breakup, yeah. I mean,
They would.
that's why I said interoperability as part of, a larger remedy that involves breaking up the different pieces. The reason that kind of monitoring was needed was because they effectively did break off a piece of Microsoft. They broke off the compliance, right? So if you had other parties that had substantive portions of an order book, you have parties who are interested enough to do all of that work that is required. If absent that, then yeah, you'd need a substantial, very technical monitoring effort. Absolutely.
We'll go to Luigi. It's his conference.
So first of all, I want to thank very much Laura that stepped in last minute, but did an excellent presentation of all these cases, particularly the Google ad case that I find it fascinating. And maybe this is too technical and feel free to dismiss it, but I was fascinated by some of the names that come out and some of the stories come out in the Google ad case. So one is the famous Project Bernanke that you cited. My understanding, but tell me whether I'm wrong, is they call it Bernanke because they were printing money. Okay, so that's stuff. Speaking of making more interesting, I think we should make more interesting. The second is this Jedi Blue stuff that, for reasons that are completely behind my ability to comprehend, was dropped in the initial U.S. anti-Google case, but I think now they are recovering. But the way I read it in the state suit is basically a contract between Google and Facebook to divide the market. Mm-hmm. And this is, again, I'm not an expert, but when I read something like this, I said, look, why do you need even a trial to do that? And it's just so obvious that, so I must be missing something. So I would like your enlightenment on that.
I think we're getting really firmly into stuff I can't talk about. But Leah, Leah and Cory, I think, and Chris, I imagine these documents well and probably have opinions about them.
I mean, I'll say that you point out something that I think gets missed when we talk about the threshold for enforcement, where there's this element where we have to know what they were thinking when they did it and understand their intentionality. And in some ways, there's this thing where they just can't stop doing the supervillain monologuing thing. And, you have Project Gazelle at Amazon, you have Project Bernanke, and so on. And Mark Zuckerberg, just telling people it's better to buy than to compete. These are problems on their own. And it's funny when they do it, right? It's funny when they trip over their own feet. But I think we also have to remember that tech is like a written culture, right? I mean, every large firm requires a written apparatus for coordination. And so memos are always there. There's fascinating work being done by the Human Rights Data Analysis Group on understanding culpability for extrajudicial killings during the Colombian Civil War by tracing the path of memos and seeing that memos that ordered a certain course of conduct led to more deaths. Those memos generated reports that went to senior officers who then did not modify the policy. And so it's a way of watching information flows, doing signals intelligence can do this. And so these are intrinsically written cultures, and there is just a paper trail in a way that I think we underestimate and that is coming to light with these cases, right? Where it just turns out that if you ask for their email, I remember we were suing Chevron over ordering a death squad to wipe out a village in Nigeria. It was a case that our legal director at the time brought with as a pro bono case when she came to us. And one day I came into the office, we had their Outlook spool, just a stack of CDs. And it was all there, right? I mean, the large firms put it in writing. They have to. And they do not have the internal discipline or knowledge to guard their speech at all times.
Luigi, it's Christina. Maybe I can jump in and say something on that because I have some knowledge of it. And I want to name check Dina because, of course, she can't make it here today. But, Laura did a fantastic job. But actually, Dina Srinivasan needs to be credited for actually uncovering Jedi Blue when she was working for Texas. I recall an early call in 2020 in which she said to me, Christina, I think we have a Section 1 thing here, because it was an agreement. And that's what it looked like, without going too much into the details. But Dina actually did start put 2 and 2 together, and then the case was developed by the Texas OAG and then was taken up by others. But I think, in my view, it is an agreement. It is Section 1. That's it.
Well, but if I just, but
it's not at the center of the cases? That's the part. But sorry, that's the part I don't understand. Why is not the center of the cases? Because it seems like so blatant, so easy to win, that why they was even dropped in the first case.
So the Jedi Blue claim was dismissed by the court
Yeah.
as not a viable Section 1 claim.
Yeah.
And why?
Because it was a traditional sort of normal vertical contract. It really should be a Section 2 claim. Well,
The claim has come back.
all right.
It's not true. It hasn't been dismissed.
Well,
Under state laws, it's come back.
it's coming back. There's stuff going on in the state courts under consumer protection law, but as a Section 1 Sherman Act claim, it was dismissed by the district court. Yeah.
It is now coming back, but
I understand.
an antitrust claim under state law.
Understand.
It is
As a
essentially a Section 1 claim. Come on.
I understand. The Sherman Act Section 1 claim was dismissed by the district court. Period.
Okay.
I mean, and all right, fine.
Okay, Matt.
So a couple. What I would say though is just because to respond a couple little really minor things, but just speak. I go by Christopher, not Chris, because my wife is named Chris. So you mentioned Unix. I mean, there's a fabulous story about Unix. It's very complicated. So it was originally given away to Berkeley people. It fragmented into 3 Berkeley version open source ones. It was about 20 private ones, and now it's 2 big families around Oracle and AT. I mean, there's a very complex story in all this. So I mean, there's a problem simplifying stuff. But I mean, bottom line is you can see the dialogue among people in Unix as they realized that in fact there was no one there to really unify the platform and to make the decisions they felt was necessary, and they felt like that was a problem. Second thing is I actually agree with standards. I think they're fabulous. The question is how the traditional model now in tech worlds is voluntary adoption of standards. You know, when I think of, you can talk about CDMA and GSM, I always think of when I teach my students, because they don't understand most of that stuff, if you read the tech literature at the time, they thought Bluetooth was going to be great and Wi-Fi was going to be nothing. And it turns out we let people vote with their feet. And the question is, if you turn that into an antitrust remedy, the determination of the standards, you're actually going to have to then obviously go through those processes. We know from long-running consent decrees what that's done to, and it was mentioned in the first case in the AT&T case. We see it in BMI ASAP. All the different remedies we see, it becomes a big issue. But the one other thing I just wanted to touch on briefly that's come up is, so acquisitions aren't necessarily bad. You know, under antitrust law. And in fact, you know, what you see is, in fact, the way I always teach my students is that back in the day, the only exit was IPO and everything else was a poor substitute. We don't live there anymore. And so if you have a world in which IPO is still on the table, there are still companies that remain independent, but some of them are made to be acquired. But more importantly, when you do the expected value calculation, maybe I get IPO, maybe I get acquired, maybe I fail. If you take option 2 off the table, the innovative incentive has to go down. And the minute we start limiting that, it's a problem. Now, here's the catch. Not all of these acquisitions are done that way. We have some that might be nascent competitor acquisitions and some that might be otherwise. How do we have the tools to tell one from the other at a time when it's so early in the game that most of these companies don't even have revenue yet? And so, I mean, this is a real problem, because if we get that wrong, we're actually going to lower the incentive for entrepreneurs to innovate in ways that I think are quite problematic. And the last thing I'll say is, you know, I actually love, you know, you're saying you disagree. I love the fact that we're disagreeing. I mean, we're at a university. The only purpose of having a discourse like this is for us to have an exchange of ideas. And I credit the organizers. I promise anyone who comes to my place, if you agree with everything you heard on any panel event I organize, I've failed. And so, you know, there's sort of an apology. Well, I'm sorry. That's what we're here for. I mean, that's the whole fun of this. And so, you know, I think that this has been I've enjoyed the discourse, but I think that what I hope is we discourse in a way that we understand we can get to an idea about, is the decision difference of opinion empirical? Is it about mechanisms? And I still remember when Fred Van Loman was still working at EFF, the very first conference of computers, freedom, and privacy, for those of you who remember it, this great conference. He asked me once, what data could I show you that would change your mind? One of the best, it's a question that's influenced everything I've done. And the question we've got here is that I think in a lot of these places, we should be asking ourselves that question constantly. What's the key to make this all go?
Cory wants
So
to.
I want to, in the spirit of friendly disagreement, I want to offer a friendly amendment to your taxonomy of the things that can happen to firms. And one of them is that your VCs can decide that you should be flipped to a large firm that, because of the curse of bigness, destroys you, which is in fact like the Yahoo story, right? Take the fortunes of the Saudi royal family, give it to Masayoshi Son, have him launder it through SoftBank, buy every promising tech startup in the Web 2.0 world, and destroy them systematically with princelings within this giant ungainly firm who are LARPing Machiavelli, right? And every single one of those companies just turns into nothing, and the users who love them and the people who built them and the value that we as a society might have gotten from them goes away. And the VCs are made whole. The founders, in many cases, did reasonably well. But I don't think we'd call that a good outcome for innovation. The only losers here are not the Saudi royals, right? There's lots of people who lose as a result.
Skipped one step, turn down Microsoft's mega billion offer because you don't want to be part of Microsoft.
I think there are a lot of companies that Microsoft didn't offer on. Flickr never got an offer from Microsoft.
I mean,
upcoming.
as someone who was still in the tech industry during the SoftBank revolution, it was like SoftBank, they've got this revolutionary idea. They are just going to throw 100 times more money at any given problem than anyone else will. And it's like, this is the big market innovation. We can just pick a winner, and we have enough money to force literally every competitor out of business. This was the great business insight. And, it was a great business insight because it completely destroyed competition and innovation, and it was legal within our current, competition law enforcement. And, great.
And it led to Uber, right? Uber and WeWork were the second act of Masayoshi Son and SoftBank.
But let's not kid ourselves that this is the best product winning, because it wasn't. It was the best capitalized product winning.
Right.
But we also have to kid ourselves as just having a big bucket
are
of money
way
doesn't
over
make you
time
believe
at this point.
But it did
So
for years.
you guys can keep arguing over coffee.
Yes, thank you.